So this is the generic opening screen for Lightroom. And what it does first is asks you to add some photos. We have none in the catalog as of yet. So the first thing we're going to do is we can actually click the little blue button in the center of the screen that says Add Photos. And what it does is it shows you to do that, you generally would come up here to the top left-hand corner and use this little circle with the plus sign in it. Now, I already have some photos put aside for this particular project. They're saved on my computer, but you can import photos from a camera that's hooked up to the computer. Your phone could be hooked up to the computer, or you could put in an SD card or other memory card. So mine are in the documents already loaded onto this particular computer. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click below them and hold the mouse down as I bring the mouse up and select all of the pictures. Now the other option, if you're selecting all, would be to hold the Command key and then A on a Mac keyboard or Control A on a PC, and that also selects all of them. You don't necessarily have to select all your photos that you're bringing in. There may be some that you don't actually want, but I generally bring all my photos in and then I delete the ones I've decided I'm not going to use once I've gotten into the program and gotten a really good look at them. Because what you're going to find is a photo that looks fantastic on a phone or in the viewfinder of a camera may not look quite as good once you get it blown up into a computer. So I go ahead and I select all of those, and then down here where it says Review for Import, the blue button in the bottom right hand corner of this menu, I click that. And what it does is it actually allows me to choose from here whether or not I'm going to continue to bring these particular photos into the program. So they're a little bit larger, and this is where you actually can then click on an individual photo. If you click the little check mark on them, it will then uncheck them and it won't bring them into your program. I'm going to go ahead and bring all these in. I'm happy with them. I'm going to add them to an album. So if you look up at the top here, it says Add to Album. Generally, what I like to do is add a new album every time I bring photos in because I'm working on different projects and I don't want them to all be grouped into one big lump of photos that I have to scroll through. So try and think of something that you can name the album that will make it unique. Some people will do a date and then a title of the album. In this case, I'm just going to call it Sample Photos. So I type the name in here and I click Create. And then over here up in the top right hand corner, I'm going to choose to add the 7 photos. And those are going to bring them into my Lightroom catalog. And so what that means is that if you look down here in the bottom left, you can see a small film strip of each of the photos. And as I click on each one, I can then see them in a larger format. I can choose the different ways I view. Right now I have it so it's just one large photo at a time. I can also click some of these buttons and I can look at them as a grid. So if I want a square grid, if I want to see all of them at once, all of these options are in the bottom left hand corner. You can also have them sorted by capture date, when they were imported, when they were modified, their name, and also what's called the star rating. Star rating is really useful. If you look down here at the very bottom, you can actually give a star rating to all of your photos. And so when I bring in a lot of new photos at once, so say I'm out and I'm shooting a wedding, or I'm covering a particular topic for my blog, what I'll do is I'll bring all those photos in and then I'll quickly go through and establish which ones I want to actually spend the time on for editing. And so I'll give them a star rating, maybe 1 or 2. And what I do is, I pick those photos I really like very quickly before I've even edited them, and I've given them a star rating. And then what I can do is I can come over here to the left again, and I can actually click and order things in order of star rating. So it's a quick way to kind of sort through your information. Now, other options up here to the left. We obviously have done the Add Photos. If you scroll down, you can also click on My Photos, which just shows you your files that you've added at this point. So you can see right now I have an Adobe sample album down here that I'm working with. And then also there's the option for sharing. Now, I tend to not share from Lightroom itself. I always export first, and then I share to various social media outlets or to my blog from there. So that's what we have over there on that side. You just go ahead and click again and it will actually take that menu out so you have a little bit more room to edit. Now over here in the bottom right, other options for this center photo here. Right now it's just fitting into the screen so I see everything. If I click Fill, It's going to zoom in so that the width of the photo fills the width of the screen. If I do 1:1, it's going to show you a 1:1 ratio. You can also zoom in further, closer, or zoom out based on here. You can hide the film strip, can put it back on. And you can also click here to toggle between the original photo and what you've edited. I haven't actually edited this photo yet, so you won't see a difference, but I'll come back to that once we've edited some. So I'm going to go back to fit because I do like to see my whole photo as I'm editing. And the primary tools that we have are going to be over here on the right hand side. You can see I'm scrolling over them. We primarily will probably only use the first couple. This is a very basic introduction to Lightroom. In fact, this isn't even the most powerful version of Lightroom. There's a Lightroom desktop program as well, which offers you even more options. But the purpose of this particular unit is for you to get in and understand basic editing with photos and move from there. So the very first option we have are the slider bars. So we click here, and this is the edit menu. So I usually tell students when they first come in, what they generally want to do is they choose the photo they want to work on. And I always suggest click this auto button up here first. And what you'll notice is that it immediately makes some adjustments to the shadows, the lightness. It adjusts anything that's too contrasty, anything that's underexposed. It will help show some of the detail. Anything that's overexposed, it will kind of tamper that down a little bit. Now, the other thing you'll notice is there's an option for clicking black and white here. And if you want to work on a black and white photo, this is the quick and easy way to do it. If you change your mind, it's not a big deal. You click the black and white button again, and it gets rid of it. Profile does the same thing, color or monochrome. You can go back and forth between the two. Okay. The first option here is light. Now, I don't tend to mess too much with light. What I do usually do is I will bring the exposure up a little bit for a lot of pictures, because I find that when I export out of Lightroom, much like when I export out of Instagram, anytime I save the photo, it naturally darkens a little bit. So I tend to just add a little bit of light to it. Contrast is just going to decrease or increase the contrast, which is just the differences between the light and darks in the photo. Highlights are going to either increase the highlights, so really brighten them up, or decrease them. Okay, and a lot of times I find myself bringing highlights down so that I can see sort of this brightness in the background that's overexposed. It kind of brings that level back down and I can see those details. Shadows does the same thing with shadows. You can either bring it up and really see in these shadow areas over here, or you can bring it down and it increases those shadows. Okay, so if you have something that's underexposed, you can't really see what's happening, bringing the shadows to the right will help you sort of see what's happening in those dark areas. Whites and black, those do similar things as well. You know, they bring up things that are white or bring them down, and the same thing with the black. They'll increase the level of black or decrease the level of black in the picture, depending on which way you slide it. So it's the basic use for light. There's also the option to use what's called a tone curve. But again, this is something that, you know, once you feel comfortable using Lightroom, you can watch a video on YouTube for the how-to. It'll give you a little bit more understanding of it, but I would say stay away from that for now. Now your next option is the color. Color is one of those things I could absolutely teach an entire semester-long class about. There is so much to do with color, but just very basically, all light is a different color. So the sunlight that you see outside is blue, and I know we draw suns as yellow, but the sunlight is actually a blue tone. And inside light, just typical light bulbs, usually have sort of an orange color. Our eyes do a great job of adjusting and balancing out those colors in our brain so that when we walk from inside to outside or vice versa, we don't notice a shockingly different expression of color on the things we're looking at. Most cameras at this point can also do that fairly well, not always. So you may find that with the white balance here, you know, this is how it was shot, the picture you're looking at now. But if I click here, I can also choose auto, and it will try to find that white balance for me. Now I feel like that's a little too orange. So the other thing I can do is I can click this eyedropper tool here, and I can look for something that's either white or should be white, or black or gray, basically a neutral color. And what it will do is it will set the white balance based off of that. So you can see there's a big difference. If I use auto, you've got sort of that too orange tone there. And it was probably thrown off because this particular image in the background is so blue. It's overcompensating for the sunlight. So instead I can use this little eyedropper. I can find a place where the sun is shining and show that this is supposed to be white, but it's a little different color because the sun is on there. And so I click on my eyedropper and I click there, and you can see it evens out those colors for me again. The other things that you can do are to change the tint, the vibrance, and the saturation. Now I'm going to switch over to this picture for this particular one. I don't play with tint very much. It's one of those things that, I might bring it a little purple. I kind of like the way that looks. Green tends to make people look sickly, so I tend to avoid that. Vibrance and saturation are very similar, but I want you to notice the difference when I play with them. Now, if I bring up the saturation, you'll notice that everything gets incredibly saturated. Now, especially if you look at our faces, they look completely unrealistic. You can tell the colors are off. I look jaundiced at this point with a really red face. Saturation just increases the intensity of a particular color. If you move it all the way to the left, that's where you take color out, and it's another way to make your photograph black and white. Now notice the difference with vibrance. Vibrance also works by bringing up color. But notice the difference in the skin tones, and that's really where you can see it. Our skin tones stay much more natural than when saturation is up. So let me show you again with the saturation. So that was vibrance all the way up, and there's the saturation all the way up. And if I want to increase the brightness and the intensity of colors, so take a look at my shirt in particular, I'm going to use vibrance more than anything else. And I'm never going to go above 60, because once you get past 60, you're really starting to make the skin tones look a little funky. And that's one of the things we're trying to avoid. All right, so that's basically all I use under color. There are obviously more things you can do. You can go in and do some color mixing and really individually play with colors. This tends to be a fun one. You can see some reds here in the background. If I click on red and I take my saturation and I bring it all the way down, you're going to notice that the reds become almost black and white. Fortunately, it works a little bit for my face too, because I have those red cheeks. I can do the same with yellow, and you'll see the chairs are going to go down to black and white. And so sometimes people will either highlight a color or dilute a color quickly doing this. The other thing you can do is you can change the hue of a particular color. So say I didn't really like the color of those chairs, I could change the hue to be a little bit more red, or I can change it to be a little more green. So it's a fun way to play around with color. And again, it's not something you have to do, but definitely something you can try. For effects, the ones that I tend to use, I don't usually use texture. If you bring texture up, it just makes it look really fake. It adds kind of almost like a fake grain to the image. Now, clarity can kind of increase the sharpness or decrease the sharpness. Sometimes when I'm doing a portrait, look at this little picture of my kid. So Kate here obviously has some pretty clear skin already, but a lot of times what people do is they'll take the clarity down just a little bit on skin, especially for older people like me. And what it does is it reduces those fine lines and blemishes a little bit, so you don't really see them. If you bring the clarity up, it makes for really cool looking eyes, but anything that is considered a blemish or a wrinkle is really going to be highlighted. Dehazing, I'll bring you over to this picture to show you the dehazing. What that does is it kind of tries to compensate for the natural haze that occurs in pictures, especially when you're in city areas. So if you move that to the right, you'll see that everything gets a little bit more bold and contrasty as it compensates for that haze. If you go the opposite way, it kind of adds the haze in. So I can make it look like it's a really cloudy day in Times Square by going all the way over to the left. Vignetting, I like to use when I've got portraits like this. And what that does is if you drag to the left, it just darkens the corners of the photograph a little bit, and it really highlights whatever's in the center. I tend to use this more on people than places. Some people will use the white. I feel like that looks like an old school 1980s photograph, but again, different people, different tastes. With the vignette, be careful not to go too much, so then it looks a little bit cheesy. But vignetting is left over from the days when the lens of the camera in analog cameras, film cameras, would actually cast a shadow on the light as it came in through the lens. And so it harkens back to that time, but again, I really like it because it's a quick, natural looking way to draw attention, make a focal point of the person in the picture. Grain is similar to texture, can add some grain in there. I don't spend a lot of time in detail. You can do some sharpening if you want to. There's some noise reduction and whatnot. For the most part, I stay away from there. Occasionally I'll come in here and I'll do enabling lens corrections. And you can see when I click that, kind of widens her face out a little bit. It takes into account the fact that the lens is curved and it takes that curve out of your picture. Same thing with any kind of chromatic aberration. You can have that clicked as well. I don't usually worry about optics. Unless you're using a fisheye lens or a really wide angle lens, you're not going to see them as much. And then the same with geometry. You can click on this and you can distort your image all kinds of ways. And again, feel free to play with this. But when you start using tools like this, you're really running the risk of crossing that boundary of ethical editing of photographs versus just going in and touching a photograph up to really kind of balance out the color or the contrast or the lighting. So that's really it for the editing tool. To get out of there, you just click here, right back on that tool. The next is the crop and rotate tool. For the most part, if you want to rotate your picture, you just go to a corner until you get this rotate arrow. You click and you can rotate any which way you'd like. Okay. Cropping is similar. You just go to the corner. You can crop it in any direction. Now you can see here when I'm trying to crop, it can crop any aspect ratio that I want. However, a lot of times people want to crop to a specific ratio. So either the original, or they might want to do a 1:1 if they're trying to get the photo ready to go on Insta. 8.5 by 11, 8 by 10, if there's a particular image that you're trying to print out. And then if you click constrain crop here, what it will do is it will stick with that particular ratio. And one of the things you'll notice, go to this picture, as you go through and you crop, the rule of thirds lines come up. And so that's if you have a picture that doesn't quite fit the rule of thirds. Here's a great example of that. Okay, my friend Janet took this picture for me, and what I might want to do is crop it a little bit so that now Noel and I are on those thirds right there and can almost get our eyes lined up on the intersections. And so when I do that and I crop, you'll see that it's a much better picture. There's a lot less headroom. Everything looks a little bit better framed. That's really it for crop and rotate. You can also rotate here. You can flip the image vertically, horizontally. Okay, be careful when you flip images though, because everything reads backward. So you can see like the Patagonia is backward, and so people will notice. And again, that runs into that issue of ethical manipulation of photographs. Now the healing brush, this is great for when you have issues with someone's face. Okay, and again, Kate really doesn't have a whole lot going on here. Her face looks pretty good, but maybe I want to get rid of that hair kind of in the middle of her pupil. I can click the healing brush and I can match what I'm trying to copy by just going to another section of the photo that looks similar. So now you can see that the hair has moved out of her face. Actually looks pretty good. I can feather that a little bit so that the edges aren't quite so harsh. I can make it more or less opaque. You can see there's a little bit of a difference there. Okay, so that's really nice. It's another great thing to use if you've got a blemish and you want to get rid of it. You can click on the person's face or whatever it is that you're trying to get rid of, power lines or whatnot, and it will actually get rid of those blemishes. So that's the healing brush. The other thing you can use is just the paintbrush. Now this is a little bit more advanced, but it can be really fun. So say I wanted to make my face black and white. What I can do is I can come over here and I can choose saturation. I can bring it all the way down. And then I can actually start to paint my face. And what you're going to see is as I go over it, okay, it's going to actually desaturate and start to make me black and white. I could do my entire shirt. You can see that it kind of continues to do that. Now you'll notice it doesn't really affect Noel as much as long as I keep that inner ring from moving outside of the image area that I'm trying to make black and white. Once I move over that, you're going to start to see that Noel will become black and white too if I overlap him. Okay, so this is again another fun way to kind of mess with all kinds of things. Now, I don't have to necessarily do saturation. I could oversaturate. I could make it so that just that area, I'm bringing the shadows up or down. Okay, and so you can see the image there as it changes a little bit. You can change the tint in just that area. So it's just a way to spot touch up things. Gradients are similar as well. You've got linear and you've got radial. Say I wanted to take a linear gradient on this particular picture. All that means is I draw, and you can see that the gradient hits its high point in the middle and then slowly kind of fades to nothing. And what I can do there is I can adjust almost anything. I can bring the exposure up, and you can see there's a gradient. So it's completely overexposed here, then slowly, as it gets to the other line here, goes back to typical exposure. Now, some people will use this to actually highlight a particular area of the photo. This works really well if I bring the exposure down in that section. This gives it a bit more of a dark sky, and then slowly kind of makes its way out so that it's back to a typical exposure. You can do, again, anything with this. You can change the saturation and desaturate that part of the sky, overly saturate it. You know, it's just a fun way to kind of mess around with things. And then similarly, you can use the radial gradient this way. Okay, so we are changing the exposure here to be really low. I could bring it up really high, kind of focus on Kate's eyes there. So again, those are just two quick tools that you can play around with. The last thing is just going through, and when you click the ... the ellipsis, it gives you a couple different options. You can copy your edit settings from one picture and you can actually paste them to another. The other thing though that I really want to show you here is just where you can reset to the original. Okay, and that brings you immediately back to whatever your picture was at the beginning. And the nice thing about that, again, is the fact that you're working in Lightroom and you're editing your pictures, but you're never touching that original file. So you can always go back to the image before you put any kind of manipulation on it, which really is a huge benefit over Photoshop, because once you've made changes in Photoshop, you cannot go back unless you've made a copy of your file. So again, back down here in the right-hand corner, you can click and it will show you the original picture. You can click again and it will show you the edited. So that's kind of nice as well, so you can kind of see the progress that you're making. Finally, you've got a couple options up here. You are automatically connected to the cloud. And so what's nice about that, you can see I have about 9.84 gigs of 100 gigs up there, sunk and backed up to the Adobe cloud. If you download the Adobe Lightroom, the mobile version, to your phone, you can connect your phone here, and the photos you upload in either place will be accessible. So that's a quick and easy way to be able to get to your photos that you've taken on your phone. It's actually really nice. I do use the Lightroom mobile app a lot when I'm editing on the go. Instagram gives you a certain amount of options, but I feel like Lightroom's just more powerful. This is if you need any help. And then finally, just exporting. When you click share, you guys are going to click save to. So for the save to settings, you just want to save as a JPEG. Choose the location you want to save it to. Make sure you know where you're saving. And then finally, you're going to choose custom size for your image. You're going to choose 2048 for the pixels. And the reason I have you do that is because that is the optimal size for uploading to Facebook. And so most people like to upload either to Facebook or their social media. And that's a large enough pixel size that regardless of whether or not it goes to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, it's still going to look clear. Then you click save and that picture gets exported. And from there, you can upload it to wherever it is that you want to use it or import it into a Google Slides. And that's all for your basic introduction to Lightroom.